The galaxy thought we were a myth, a cautionary tale about a species too brutal to survive their own cradle. They quarantined our system, branded Earth a death world, and left us to choke on our own ashes. They were wrong. We didn't die. We just got quiet. We built, we waited, and we listened. Then out of the deep dark, an alien civilization begged for their lives, and the universe learned exactly what happens when you wake the monsters to fight your demons. The coffee tasted like burnt pennies and ozone. Ale-Red Marshall swirled the muddy liquid at the bottom of his ceramic mug, watching the gritty residue cling to the sides. It was his third cup of the shift, or maybe his fourth. Time didn't really exist on Deep Space Relay Station Acheron, a rusted tin can orbiting a dead moon in the Oort cloud. Here, there was only the low, omnipresent vibration of the life support scrubbers and the endless, suffocating black of the monitors. Ale-Red scratched at his jaw, his fingernails catching on 3 days of rough graying stubble. The air in the comms bay smelled stale. It always smelled stale, a distinct cocktail of recycled breath, hot electronics, and the faint, sour tang of nervous sweat that clung to the padded fabric of the command chairs. He shifted his weight. The leather groaned, a sound that cut through the monotonous hum of the room like a dull knife. "Marshall," the intercom buzzed, the audio clipping at the edges. "You awake down there?" Ale-Red pressed the talk button, leaving a smudge of oil from his thumb on the plastic. "Functionally, B. Biologically, I died 3 hours ago. What do you need?" "Just checking," Beatrice Gallagher's voice crackled back. "Scanners are showing a micrometeorite shower in Sector 4. Nothing to worry about, but the proximity alarms might trip. Don't soil yourself." "Noted. I'll put a towel down." Ale-Red released the button and exhaled, a long, ragged sound that fluttered the collar of his faded uniform. He leaned back, resting his boots on the edge of the secondary console. He wasn't supposed to do that. It was against Earth Defense Directorate regulations. But out here, 4 billion miles from the closest inspector, regulations were just suggestions written by people who had never experienced the mind-numbing sensory deprivation of deep space duty. Humanity had been sitting in the dark for 200 years, ever since the first contact debacle, when the Galactic Concordate took one look at our history of nuclear war, bioweapons, and industrialized slaughter, and immediately locked the door behind them. They declared the Sol system a Class 9 hazard zone, a death world. They threw up a hyperspace exclusion net and left us alone. At first, humanity was furious. Then we were paranoid. We spent a century turning our solar system into an impenetrable fortress, waiting for an invasion that never came. Eventually, the paranoia faded into a dull, bureaucratic apathy. Now, guys like Ale-Red sat in the dark, listening to the static of a universe that had ghosted them. Ale-Red stared at the primary oscilloscope, a flat, jagged green line of background cosmic radiation. Bleep! Bleep, bleep. It was a lullaby of nothingness. He reached for his coffee. Screak! The sound didn't come from the speakers. It felt like it drove a rusted spike directly through the center of Ale-Red's skull. His hand jerked. The mug shattered against the steel deck, splashing lukewarm, dark brown sludge across his boots. "Jesus!" Ale-Red grabbed his headset, ripping it off his ears as the audio peaked into the red zone. The oscilloscope wasn't flat anymore. It was a chaotic, violent explosion of jagged peaks and valleys, moving so fast the green phosphor blurred into a solid block of bright, painful light. He slammed his hand on the dampener, choking the audio output to a manageable buzz, but the raw data was still flooding in. It wasn't a pulsar, it wasn't a quasar burst. It was a signal, organized, repeating, and saturated with an energy output that made the relay's cooling fans instantly kick into overdrive, whining like tortured animals. Ale-Red's hands were shaking. He looked at his fingers, annoyed by the tremor, and wiped them on his trousers. "B," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all the cynical drawl from a moment ago. "B, get down here. I told you about the meteorites, Artie. Did the alarms spook you?" "It's not a rock, B." Ale-Red leaned closer to the screen, the green light reflecting in his wide, bloodshot eyes. He typed frantically, routing the signal through the quantum filters, stripping away the cosmic noise. "It's a wide-beam broadcast. Subspace compression. It's... God, the bandwidth is massive. A broadcast? From who? Jupiter Colony?" "No." Aelred swallowed hard. His mouth was completely dry. He tasted old metal. Origin point is outside the net. Way outside. We're talking the Cygnus arm. Silence on the intercom. Then the heavy, rapid thud of boots on the metal grating of the spiral staircase. Beatrice Gallagher came through the bulkhead door like a storm front. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered, with hair pulled back into a severe, utilitarian knot. She smelled like engine grease and strong peppermint. Her face was flushed, her jaw set tightly. "Show me," she demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. Aelred tapped the glass of the monitor. "It's repeating every 30 seconds. It's encrypted, but not well. It's messy, like it was thrown together in a panic." Bee leaned over his shoulder, her calloused hands gripping the back of his chair. He could hear her breathing, shallow, fast. "Play it," she said. "It's going to hurt. Play it, Aelred." He disengaged the dampener and fed the signal back through the primary speakers. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound that defied human anatomy, a high-pitched, warbling sequence of clicks and guttural, wet thumps. But beneath the alien linguistics, there was something undeniably, universally recognizable. Panic, terror. It sounded like an animal caught in a snare, tearing its own leg off to escape. Underneath the voice, there were other sounds, deep, concussive booms, the distinct, terrifying screech of metal buckling under immense pressure, the wet, tearing sounds of decompression. Aelred felt his stomach heave. He swallowed down the bitter taste of bile. "It's an SOS, he whispered, staring at the green waveforms. "It's a distress call." Bee didn't say anything. She just stared at the screen, her knuckles turning white against the black leather of the chair. Humanity hadn't heard a word from the stars in 2 centuries, and the first thing they hear is a scream. Simon Caldwell was the last person you wanted in a crisis, which was exactly why he was assigned to tactical on Acheron. He was methodical, irritatingly slow, and possessed a deeply ingrained apathy that bordered on the pathological. When he shuffled into the comms bay, wearing a wrinkled undershirt and holding a half-eaten protein bar, he looked at the frantic waveforms on the screen with the mild annoyance of a man discovering a parking ticket on his windshield. "I was asleep," Simon said, chewing slowly. "Wake up," Bee snapped, pointing at the console. "We have a Class 1 intercept, extraterrestrial origin. Aelred is feeding it into the translation matrix now." Simon stopped chewing. He looked at Bee, then at Aelred, then at the screen. He swallowed the dry mass in his mouth heavily. "You're kidding. The Concordat? Are they lifting the quarantine? Does this sound like a diplomatic envoy to you?" Aelred hit the playback. The speakers spat out the terrifying, wet screams and the concussive shattering of a dying ship. Simon visibly paled. The remaining half of his protein bar fell from his fingers, hitting the deck with a soft, pathetic thud. "Christ almighty! Run the linguistic heuristic," Bee ordered, her voice completely devoid of emotion. It was her coping mechanism. When things got real, Bee turned into a machine. "Match it against the first contact archives. The Concordat gave us a basic linguistic key before they slammed the door. Let's see if it still works." Aelred's fingers danced across the physical keyboard. He didn't trust touch screens for this. He needed the tactile feedback, the heavy mechanical clack, clack, clack of the keys to ground him. Sweat was pooling in the small of his back, plastering his undershirt to his skin. He initiated the translation sequence. The station's aging AI core groaned, the cooling systems whining in protest as it crunched petabytes of alien syntax against 200-year-old dictionaries. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours. The comms bay was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rhythmic, tortured breathing of the alien on the looping recording. It was wearing them down. Aelred felt a headache blooming behind his left eye, a sharp, pulsing pressure. He wanted to turn it off. He wanted to delete the file, wipe the drives, and go back to his stale coffee. If he erased it, it didn't happen. No one on Earth would know. Humanity could stay in its safe, isolated bubble. Why should we care? The thought bubbled up in Aelred's mind, ugly and selfish. They called us monsters. They looked at us like we were rabid dogs. They left us to rot. "Got a match," Simon said quietly from the tactical terminal. He sounded sick. "Species classification, Kayla, avian mammalian hybrid, high intelligence, fragile physiology. They were the ones who proposed the quarantine on Earth." Aelred stopped typing. He looked at Simon. "The sailor. Yeah. Simon pulled up an archival image, a delicate, spindly creature with iridescent, feathered crests and large, empathetic eyes. They looked like glass sculptures, beautiful, fragile. Translation matrix is compiling, Aelred said, his voice tight. Text began to spool across his primary monitor. It was fragmented, broken by static and explosions, but the meaning was unmistakably, horrifyingly clear. He read it aloud, his voice flat, trying to keep the horror out of his throat. Central Command. Relay station falling. They do not stop. The Vrak. They are inside the perimeter. Orbital defenses shattered. Colony worlds burning. Billions dead. Please, anyone. They do not take prisoners. They are consuming the biosphere. Please. We are unarmed. We are... The text stopped. The audio cut out with a final wet crunch, followed by the dull hiss of vacuum. The silence in the comms bay was absolute. It felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on their chests. Aelred realized he was holding his breath. He let it out slowly, his hands resting on his thighs. They were trembling violently now, and he didn't care. The Vrak, Bee whispered. She walked over to the viewport, staring out into the endless star-speckled void. Her reflection in the armored glass looked old, tired. A hive species. The Concordat had treaties with them, right? Treaties break, Simon said quietly. If the Vrak are consuming Kayla colony worlds, that's not a war, that's an extermination. Aelred stared at the fragmented text. The internal contradiction tore at him. These were the very aliens who had judged humanity, who had condemned them to solitary confinement because humans were too aggressive, too violent, too dangerous. Now, their pacifism, their delicate, civilized society was being butchered. They broadcast on an open subspace frequency, Aelred said, his voice raspy. It wasn't a targeted message, it was a blind cast, a dying scream into the dark, hoping someone, anyone, was listening. And we heard it, Bee said. She turned around. The mechanic, practical look was gone from her eyes. In its place was something cold, something ancient and uniquely human. It was the look of a predator realizing another predator was hunting in its woods. Package the data, Aelred. Everything. The raw audio, the translation, the telemetry. Bee, Simon warned, taking a step forward. If we send this to Earth Command, you know what will happen. The Directorate has been building a war machine for 2 centuries with no one to fight. If you give them a target... I know exactly what will happen, Bee said. She walked over to the console, leaning down so she was eye level with Aelred. She smelled like peppermint and adrenaline. We are monsters, Simon. That's what they called us. But right now, out there, kids are being eaten alive by giant bugs. And I don't care what they called us. A slaughter is a slaughter. Aelred looked at her. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He wasn't heroic. He was just a guy who wanted to finish his shift. But he looked at the translation on the screen. Please, anyone. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner. The console chirped. Encrypting package, Aelred said, his voice steadying. Routing to High Command. Earth. Priority 0, extinction level event protocol. He hit send. The sleeping giant had just been handed an alarm clock. The wait was the worst part. 48 hours passed since Aelred pushed the button. 48 hours of deafening silence from Earth. The isolation of Acheron had never felt so profound. The station felt like a tomb. Aelred hadn't slept. His eyes felt like they were full of crushed glass. He sat at his console, staring at the empty readouts, jumping at every minor fluctuation in the power grid. Simon paced the tactical deck, muttering to himself, calculating the distances, the logistics of a war that wasn't theirs. Bee had retreated to the engineering bay, stripping down a perfectly functional coolant pump just to keep her hands busy. The tension on the station was a physical thing. You could taste it in the recycled air. It tasted like copper and anticipation. Maybe they ignored it, Simon said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He didn't look at Aelred. He just kept pacing. Maybe the Directorate looked at it, saw it was the Kayla, and decided to let them burn. Poetic justice, right? Shut up, Simon, Aelred murmured, rubbing his temples. I'm just saying, we don't owe them anything. Earth is safe behind the exclusion net. Why would High Command risk our fleet for a galaxy that hates us? Because we are bored, Bee's voice rang out as she climbed the spiral stairs, wiping grease from her hands with a stained rag. 200 years of military-industrial complex with no outlet. The Directorate doesn't care about poetic justice. They care about testing the toys they built. Aelred looked at the clock. 400 hours. The shift was supposed to be over. Nobody moved to leave. Then the station shuddered. It wasn't a subtle vibration. It was a deep, bone-rattling tectonic groan that resonated through the steel bulkheads. The coffee mug on Aelred's desk, a fresh one he had poured an hour ago, vibrated across the laminate surface and tipped over, spilling brown liquid. Aelred didn't even flinch. "Micrometeorites?" Simon squeaked, his hands gripping the railing. "No," Bee said, her eyes snapping to the viewport. The primary alarms didn't go off. Instead, the station's passive gravitational sensors began to scream. A klaxon blared, a harsh, rhythmic bzzzt bzzzt that made Aelred's teeth ache. The oscilloscope on his monitor didn't show a signal. It showed a massive, terrifying anomaly in the fabric of space itself. "Gravimetric displacement," Aelred shouted over the klaxon, his fingers flying across the keys. "Massive. Oh my God, the scales. It's huge. Just outside the exclusion net. Sector 7. "Are we under attack?" Simon panicked, scrambling toward the weapons console. "Did the Vrak track the signal back to us?" "It's not incoming," Bee said. She walked slowly to the viewport, pressing her hand against the cold, thick glass. "It's outgoing." Aelred joined her at the window. The void of space, usually a pristine, empty black canvas dotted with distant, cold stars, was tearing open. It started as a pinprick of violet light, bleeding into the dark like ink in water. Then space itself seemed to fold inward, collapsing with a silent, visual shockwave that distorted the starlight around it. The jump gate, a piece of theoretical technology Aelred had only read about in classified directorate briefings, was opening. And then the fleet arrived. They didn't glide out of the portal with the sleek, aerodynamic grace of the Concordate ships. Human warships were not designed to be beautiful. They were designed by a species born in gravity, raised in war, and paranoid of annihilation. They were ugly. They were brutal. The first ship to breach the threshold was a dreadnought. It was a massive, jagged slab of dark grey armor, shaped like a bruised knuckles. It had no smooth curves, only harsh angles designed to deflect kinetic impacts. Its hull was bristling with weapons, mass drivers the size of skyscrapers, railgun batteries, and thermal lances that glowed with a dull, angry red heat. The sheer mass of the vessel exerted its own microgravity, pulling dust and debris into its wake. "By God," Simon whispered, his breath fogging the glass. It wasn't just one ship. Behind the dreadnought came the cruisers, the destroyers, the carrier groups, hundreds of them, thousands. They poured out of the spatial tear like hornets from a kicked nest. The visual scanners struggled to comprehend the scale of the armada. Their engine trails burned with a fierce, blinding blue-white fury, illuminating the icy rocks of the Oort cloud. Aelred felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't looking at a rescue mission. He was looking at a force of nature. For 2 centuries, humanity had poured its trauma, its fear, and its undeniable talent for violence into forging this fleet. They had built a hammer large enough to shatter a star, and they had just been waiting for a nail. His console chimed, a tight beam transmission, encrypted with Earth Directorate codes. Aelred stumbled back to his chair, his legs feeling like lead. He accepted the transmission. It was a text-only read, plain, unformatted, and utterly devoid of diplomatic grace. "Directorate Fleet Command to relay Acheron. Signal received. Translation verified. Target locked. The hive will burn. Maintain comms. We are going hunting." Aelred read the message twice. He looked back up at the viewport. The armada was aligning, their massive engines flaring in unison as they prepared to make the jump to the Cygnus arm. There was no poetry in it, no grand declaration of saving the galaxy, just the cold, mechanical reality of a predator unleashed. The sleeping giant hadn't just woken up. It was hungry, Bee placed a hand on Aelred's shoulder. Her grip was tight, grounding him. "Well, Aelred," she said, her voice barely a whisper over the hum of the station. "You wanted something to happen." Aelred swallowed the lump in his throat. He looked at the brutal, jagged silhouettes of the human ships blotting out the stars. "God help the Vrak," Aelred said, and for the first time in his life he meant it. The data lag was exactly 17 minutes. For 17 minutes, Aelred, Bee, and Simon sat in a purgatory of absolute silence, waiting for the light to bounce back from the Cygnus arm. Aelred rubbed his eyes until bursts of static bloomed behind his eyelids. His lower back ached with a dull, throbbing heat. The comms bay smelled of overworked ozone and the sour, sharp tang of Simon's nervous sweat. The tactical deck's primary screen was split into a dozen empty black squares, waiting for the tight beam telemetry to connect. "They're out of FTL," Simon muttered, his eyes glued to a secondary readout. His voice was a raspy whisper, like a man trying not to wake a sleeping dog. "Displacement wave registered. They're in the system." Aelred leaned forward, his chest pressed against the hard, cold plastic edge of the console. "Routing visual feeds now." The black squares on the monitor flickered. A burst of digital artifacting tore across the screens, rendering jagged blocks of grey and green. Then, the signal stabilized, locking onto the optical arrays of the lead Directorate dreadnought, the Goliath. Aelred stopped breathing. The sailor homeworld, Ethelgard, hung in the center of the feed. The archival photos Simon had pulled up hours ago showed a vibrant marble of sapphire oceans and swirling, delicate white clouds. The planet on the screen was a corpse. The atmosphere was choked with thick, bruised clouds of brown and sickly yellow. Massive, continent-spanning fires glowed like festering wounds beneath the smog. And then there was the Vrak fleet. "Jesus," Bee breathed, stepping closer to the screen. They weren't ships, not in any human sense. They were colossal, chitinous biological masses, orbiting the planet like a swarm of deep-sea parasites. They had no engines, no thrusters, no metal hulls. They were constructed of dark, ribbed carapaces, pulsing with thick, glowing veins of bioluminescent green fluid. Giant, fleshy tendrils drifted lazily from their undersides, dropping spore sacs into the sailor atmosphere. They looked like tumors floating in the void. There were thousands of them. "Sensors are reading zero-energy signatures from the sailor orbital defense grid," Simon said, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "It's gone. The Vrak are just hovering. They're feeding." "Not anymore," Aelred said. On the feed, the human fleet didn't bother with a tactical formation. They didn't hail the Vrak. They didn't broadcast a demand for surrender. The Directorate had spent 200 years trapped in a cage, imagining the monsters waiting for them in the dark. Now, they were face to face with the real thing, and they had absolutely zero interest in talking. The Goliath fired. There was no sound in the vacuum of space, and the optical sensors didn't pick up a bright cinematic laser beam. A magnetic accelerator cannon round is just a 3-ton slug of depleted uranium, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. It doesn't glow, it doesn't sing, it just destroys. On the screen, the largest Vrak hive ship, a bloated, pulsating monstrosity the size of Earth's moon, simply ceased to be whole. 1 second it was there, and the next, a massive, invisible fist punched a hole straight through its center. A geyser of black, freezing ichor and jagged chunks of bone-like armor erupted from its backside. The sheer kinetic force of the impact sent shockwaves rippling through the creature's gelatinous superstructure. A second later, the ship's internal pressure equalized with the vacuum, and it detonated from the inside out, raining frozen meat down toward the planet's gravity well. "Direct hit," Simon choked out. He looked nauseous. God, the kinetic yield on that. The rest of the human fleet opened up. The void lit up with the staccato, brutal flashes of secondary railgun batteries. It was a chaotic, unchoreographed slaughter. The human ships waded into the biological swarm like men wielding sledgehammers in a slaughterhouse. They didn't use shields. They relied on yards-thick sloped armor. When the Vrak finally reacted, spewing streams of acidic plasma and firing biological missiles tipped with bone-shattering spikes, the human ships just took the hits. Aelred watched a Vrak plasma stream wash over the hull of a human destroyer. The metal glowed cherry red, the outer layer sloughing off like molten wax, but the ship didn't even alter its course. close. It rammed its massive, wedge-shaped prow directly into a Vrak cruiser, the physical collision tearing the alien vessel in half with a sickening, silent crunch of collapsing chitin. It was ugly. It was deeply, inherently unrefined. It wasn't the elegant, surgical combat the concordate species prized. It was a bar fight in the dark. Aelred felt his stomach churn, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. He watched the absolute butchery unfolding on the screen, and underneath the horror, underneath the civilized, rational part of his brain, a dark, primal knot of satisfaction tightened in his gut. He hated himself for it. He hated that his heart was racing not with terror but with adrenaline. "They're clearing the orbital path," Bee said, her voice clinical, but Aelred could see her hands shaking as she gripped the back of his chair. "The dreadnoughts are forming a blockade. The carriers are moving in. Moving in for what?" Simon asked, wiping his mouth with the back of a trembling hand. "The orbit is a meat grinder." "Atmospheric drop," Aelred replied, reading the telemetry scrolling down his secondary monitor. "The Vrak are already on the ground. The Sailor are being slaughtered down there. The fleet isn't just stopping the bombardment. They're sending in the Marines." He tapped a physical switch, routing the planetary audio feeds. "Brace yourselves. It's going to get loud." The audio feed hit the comms bay speakers like a physical blow. It was a wall of noise, the deafening, rushing roar of atmospheric friction, mixed with the frantic, overlapping chatter of 100 human squads. Aelred winced, his hand hovering over the volume dial, but he didn't turn it down. He needed to hear it. He needed to ground himself in the reality of what he had started by pushing that button. "Vanguard actual to all pods. Atmospheric breach in 5. Shield your optics." "Copy that, actual. My pod's shaking like a cheap washing machine." "Stow it, Corporal. Check your seals. We're dropping right into the capital city's central plaza. Gravity is 0.8 Earth normal. You're going to feel light. Don't overextend your swings." Aelred linked a helmet cam from one of the Vanguard sergeants, a man tagged as Hayes. The video was chaotic, violently shaking as the drop pod plummeted through the bruised yellow clouds of Ethelgard. Through the small, reinforced viewport of the pod, Aelred saw the ground rushing up. It was a nightmare. The Sailor City was a sprawling metropolis of delicate, crystalline spires and sweeping, curved architecture. Or it had been. Now it was a burning ruin. The streets were flooded with a writhing black tide of Vrak ground forces. They were terrifying up close, segmented, multi-legged horrors with razor-sharp mandibles and scythe-like forelimbs. They moved with a twitchy, unnatural speed, swarming over the shattered glass and crushed stone of the city. "Brace for impact!" Hayes yelled over the comms. The video feed jerked violently. The heavy metallic clang of the drop pod hitting the alien bedrock rattled the speakers in the relay station. Explosive bolts fired. The heavy steel doors of the pod blew outward, crushing a half-dozen Vrak instantly beneath a ton of superheated metal. Hayes charged out. Aelred clamped his jaw shut. The human Marines were clad in Mark IV powered armor. They looked like walking tanks, utterly devoid of aesthetic grace, bulky, angular, and painted a matte, light-absorbing black. The Vrak swarmed them immediately, a tidal wave of screeching, clicking chitin. Hayes didn't use a clean, localized energy weapon. He raised an auto shotgun the size of a jackhammer. The rhythmic, deafening thud, thud, thud of the weapon echoed through the feed. It fired heavy, explosive-tipped tungsten slugs. Aelred watched, mesmerized by the grotesque physics of it. As a Vrak warrior was hit mid-leap, the slug caught it in the center mass. The alien didn't just die, it ruptured. Thick, green fluid and jagged pieces of shell sprayed across the ruined sailor masonry. It was a massacre. The humans were fighting with a savagery that matched the hive. "Clear the perimeter! Push them back from the bunker doors!" Hayes roared. The camera whipped around. Behind the human drop zone were the massive, reinforced doors of a sailor subterranean shelter. The doors were buckled, heavily scarred by Vrak acid, on the verge of giving way. Aelred watched as a massive Vrak, a specialized siege beast the size of a garbage truck, barreled toward the bunker. Its armored head was lowered, ready to ram the failing doors. Hayes didn't have time to reload. He dropped the shotgun, letting it hang on its magnetic sling, and drew a high-carbon combat blade. It wasn't a glowing sword of energy. It was just 3 feet of sharpened, ugly steel. He activated the jump jets on his armor, launching himself directly at the charging beast. He landed squarely on its back. The creature shrieked, thrashing wildly. Hayes drove the blade down, punching through the heavy plates of armor at the base of the creature's neck. He didn't pull it out. He twisted it, using the hydraulic strength of the power armor to wrench the plates apart, exposing the soft, pulsating nerve cluster beneath. He reached in with his armored gauntlet and crushed it. The beast collapsed, skidding to a halt mere feet from the bunker doors, burying Hayes in a cloud of crushed rock and dust. Silence fell over the comms bay. Aelred stared at the screen. Hayes stood up, coated in a thick, dripping layer of green vrak blood. He kicked the dead beast off his boot, retrieved his shotgun, and racked a new shell. "They're not soldiers," Simon whispered, his eyes wide, terrified. "They're butchers." "They're what's needed," Bee said, but her voice was hollow. She was gripping the console so hard her knuckles were bone white. On the screen, the battered doors of the sailor bunker slowly, hesitantly hissed open. Through Hayes' camera, Aelred saw them, the sailor. A small group of them stood in the dim light of the shelter. They were incredibly fragile-looking, their iridescent feathers dull and matted with ash. Their large, liquid eyes were wide with a terror so profound it transcended species. They weren't looking at the dead vrak, they were looking at Hayes. They were looking at the massive, blood-soaked, faceless human towering over the corpses of the monsters that had butchered their world. The sailor ambassador in the center of the group took a trembling step backward, wrapping his spindly arms around a younger sailor. They recognized the armor. They recognized the emblem of the Earth Directorate painted on the chest plate. They realized that their blind plea into the dark had been answered by the very demons they had locked away. Hayes stood there for a moment. He looked at the trembling aliens. He didn't speak their language. He didn't offer a hand. He just reached up, wiped a smear of green gore off his visor, and turned his back on them to face the street. "Bunker secured." Hayes's voice crackled flatly over the comms. "Move into the next grid. Give me some covering fire." Aelred slumped back into his leather chair. The leather groaned. The coffee puddle on the floor had dried into a sticky brown stain. He closed his eyes. The image of the terrified sailor burned into his retinas. Humanity had arrived to save the galaxy, and Aelred knew with a sickening absolute certainty that the galaxy would never forgive them for it. The combat feeds went on for another 6 hours. 6 hours of unadulterated industrial slaughter. Aelred didn't watch all of it. He couldn't. At hour 3, a deep, pervasive nausea had settled in his gut, a cold block of lead that made his limbs feel weak. He had muted the primary audio after a human heavy weapons squad had cornered a vrak broodmother in a subterranean spawning pool. The sounds of high-explosive incendiaries detonating in an enclosed space, mixed with the wet, desperate shrieking of a dying alien matriarch, was something Aelred knew would wake him up in cold sweats for the rest of his life. Simon had fared worse. He was currently sitting on the floor in the far corner of the comms bay, his knees pulled up to his chest. He had thrown up twice into the metal recycling bin. The acrid smell of vomit now mingled with the stale ozone and nervous sweat of the room. Simon was staring at the floor grating, his fingers twitching rhythmically against his pant leg. "They're not stopping," Simon whispered. He had been saying it, like a broken mantra, for the last hour. "They're supposed to stop when the city is clear. They're not stopping." He was right. Aelred rubbed a hand over his face. His skin felt greasy. The stubble on his jaw was abrasive against his palm. He looked at the tactical map on the secondary monitor. The blue icons representing Directorate forces weren't just holding defensive perimeters around the sailor civilian centers. They were pushing out. They were aggressively hunting down retreating vrak swarms, pushing them into kill zones, and annihilating them with overlapping artillery fire. It was a systematic extermination. "They're making sure," Bee said. She hadn't moved from her spot behind Aelred's chair. Her voice was flat, hollowed out by the sheer scale of the violence they had witnessed. "You don't leave half a wasp nest in your attic, Simon. You burn the whole thing." "But they're fleeing," Simon protested weakly, not looking up. "The vrak are trying to get back to their remaining orbiters. They're breaking." "And the Directorate is breaking them faster," Aelred said, his voice rasping. His throat was incredibly dry, but he couldn't stomach the thought of drinking anything. He tapped a few keys, bringing up the orbital telemetry. The Goliath just locked tractor beams onto the 3 largest retreating hive ships. They're dragging them back into the gravity well. They're not letting anyone leave. Aelred zoomed in on a live feed from the surface. The capital city of Ethelgard was quiet now. The sky was still a bruised, sickly yellow, choking on ash and the chemical smoke of burning alien biology. The human Marines were doing cleanup. There was nothing heroic about the visual. It looked like a municipal sanitation job if the trash consisted of dismembered armor-plated apex predators. Heavy, treaded engineering vehicles, bulldozers painted matte black, were pushing massive piles of wrack corpses into deep impact craters. Marines walked the perimeters, their armor scorched and coated in dried, blackening ichor, firing single heavy rounds into any carcass that twitched. Off to the side, behind the flickering blue hum of a portable Directorate energy shield, stood the sailor. Hundreds of them had emerged from the bunkers. They were huddled together in the ruined courtyard of what used to be a grand crystalline plaza. They didn't look relieved. They looked like hostages. They watched the hulking, faceless humans work with wide, unblinking eyes. Every time a Marine turned their head in the sailor's direction, the aliens flinched collectively, stepping backward in unison. "They think they just traded one predator for another," Bee murmured. She finally moved, walking over to the coffee station and picking up a rag to wipe down the counter. It was a pointless gesture. The counter was clean. She just needed to move her hands. "Didn't they?" Aelred asked. Bee stopped wiping. She looked at Aelred, her expression hardening. "We saved them, Artie. Don't go soft on me now. If we hadn't come, that whole planet would be an all-you-can-eat buffet by tomorrow morning." "I know," Aelred said. He leaned his head back against the chair, staring up at the low metal ceiling. A single exposed wire hung from a vent, vibrating slightly with the station's life support hum. "But look at them, Bee. They're terrified of us. We didn't come here as peacekeepers. We came here as an execution squad, and the whole galaxy is watching." His console chirped, a sharp, high-priority ping that cut through the heavy silence of the room like a scalpel. Aelred sat up, his spine cracking in protest. He looked at the readout, his breath caught in his throat. "What is it?" Simon asked, scrambling up from the floor, wiping his mouth with the back of his sleeve. "Incoming VRAC reinforcements?" "No," Aelred said. His hands hovered over the keyboard. He felt a sudden, intense chill. "It's the Goliath. Fleet Command. They're pinging our relay." "For what? They have their own deep space comms arrays," Bee said, walking back over. "They don't want to talk to Earth," Aelred said, reading the routing headers. "They want us to open the Concordat diplomatic channels, all of them." Simon paled. "The quarantine frequencies? If we broadcast on those, every species in the Orion Arm will know we bypassed the exclusion net." "They already know, Simon," Bee snapped. "You don't vaporize a moon-sized bug without tripping a few seismographs. The Directorate wants to make an announcement." Aelred hesitated. His finger rested on the execute key. If pushing the first button had opened the cage, pushing this one would burn down the zoo. He looked at the screen, at the terrified sailor shivering behind a human shield. "Do it, Aelred," Bee said softly. "Finish what you started." Aelred pressed the key. The station's ancient transmission towers groaned as they aligned, dumping raw power into the long-dormant diplomatic frequencies. The visual feed clicked over. The chaotic, ash-choked streets of Ethelgard vanished, replaced by the stark, sterile interior of the Goliath's command bridge. It was dark, lit primarily by the tactical hololiths projecting from the deck. In the center of the frame stood Admiral Gregory Miller. Miller was a man built like a cinder block. He didn't look like a statesman. He wore standard, heavy-duty naval fatigues, the dark fabric rolled up at the elbows, revealing thick forearms scarred by shrapnel from some forgotten training accident. He looked exhausted. Deep, bruised bags hung under his pale, icy blue eyes. He held a steaming mug of something in his right hand, the knuckles white and rigid. The screen split. On the right side, the feed connected to the Sailor Provisional Government, relayed from a surviving bunker complex on the surface. The sailor speaker stepped into the frame. He was an older sailor, his plumage a muted, dignified silver, though it was currently ruffled and dull with dust. He leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane. He looked at the screen, at the hulking, unsmiling human, and visibly swallowed. When the speaker talked, Aelred's translation matrix caught the audio, spitting it out in flat, synthesized English. "I am Speaker Valen. On behalf of the Taylor Concordat, we owe you our survival. The VRAC hive is broken. Our world is secured." Miller didn't nod. He didn't smile. He took a slow sip from his mug. The silence dragged on. It was abrasive. Aelred shifted uncomfortably in his chair, feeling the weight of the awkwardness millions of miles away. "Your intervention was unexpected," Speaker Valen continued. his voice trembling slightly. "The Galactic Concordat believed your species to be confined. We are grateful, but we must ask, what are your intentions? When will your forces withdraw behind the soul exclusion net?" Miller lowered his mug. He stared into the camera. It felt as though he was looking directly into Aelred's soul, right through the relay station and out into the wider galaxy. "Speaker Valen," Miller said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble. It didn't sound angry. It sounded terrifyingly calm. "Let me clear up a misconception. We didn't leave our system to do you a favor." The speaker blinked, his delicate hands gripping the head of his cane. "I do not understand." 200 years ago, Miller said, taking a slow step forward, filling more of the camera frame. "Your people and the rest of the Concordat looked at Earth. You saw our wars. You saw our weapons. You called us a rabid species, a danger to the galactic community. So you locked us in our own backyard and threw away the key." Miller paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "You told us we were monsters," Miller continued. "And you were right. We are. But here's the problem, Speaker. You built a civilized galaxy. You bred the aggression out of yourselves. You turned your warships into diplomatic cruisers. And when the real monsters came knocking, when the Vrak decided they were hungry, your civilization was nothing but meat on a silver platter." Aelred felt a lump form in his throat. Miller wasn't delivering a speech. He was delivering a verdict. "Admiral," Speaker Valen pleaded, his feathers flattening against his head in a universal sign of distress. "We recognize our error. We are prepared to offer reparations. We can petition the Concordat to lift the quarantine, to welcome humanity to the galactic table." Miller let out a short, humorless laugh. It sounded like grinding stones. "We don't want a seat at your table, Valen. The table is broken." Miller set his mug down on the hololith console. "You broadcast an SOS on an open frequency. You begged anyone to come save you. We heard you. We came. We killed the bugs. But we're not going back in the cage." The sailor speaker looked genuinely faint. He swayed slightly on his cane. What are you demanding?" "We aren't demanding anything," Miller said simply. "I am informing you. The soul exclusion net is dismantled. The Earth Directorate is claiming the Cygnus Arm as a buffer zone. Your world, Ethelgard, is now a Directorate Protectorate." "A protectorate? You mean an occupation?" Valen's voice pitched upward in panic. "You cannot simply annex sovereign space. The Concordat will not allow this." "The Concordat," Miller said, his eyes narrowing, "couldn't stop a swarm of overgrown cockroaches from eating your capital city. If they want to contest our claim, they know exactly where our fleet is." Miller leaned into the camera. "You wanted to know our intentions, Speaker? It's simple. You proved you can't protect yourselves. The galaxy is a dark, dangerous forest, and you are all walking through it blindfolded. So, from now on, humanity is taking over the Night Watch. We are the apex predators now. Stay out of our way, and you get to live." Miller didn't wait for a response. He reached out and severed the connection. The right side of the screen went black. The left side held Miller's image for a few seconds longer before the transmission cut, leaving only the Directorate seal burning on the monitors of the Acheron relay. In the comms bay, the silence returned, heavier and colder than before. Simon was still sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the wall. Bee was leaning against the counter, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her jaw locked in a rigid line. Aelred looked at his hands. They were steady now. The adrenaline was completely gone, replaced by a profound, chilling clarity. They hadn't just saved a planet, they had conquered one. The Directorate had used the sailors' desperate plea as a pretext to launch a galactic coup. "They played us," Aelred whispered to the empty room. "Command. They were waiting for this. They had that fleet fueled and ready. They just needed an excuse to cross the line, and I handed it to them." Bee walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a heavy, grounding weight. "You did your job, Aelred," she said. Her voice lacked its usual bite. "You heard a scream, and you called the cops. It's not your fault the cops decided to burn down the neighborhood." Aelred looked back up at the black screens. The static of the deep void began to slowly bleed back onto the oscilloscope, a jagged green line of cosmic background radiation. The galaxy was quiet again, but it wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the breathless, terrifying silence of prey hiding in the tall grass, waiting for the tiger to pass. The lower deck servers were baking. Aelred could feel the dry, oppressive heat radiating up through the grated steel floorboards, pressing against the soles of his boots. The station's environmental scrubbers were whining at a high, desperate pitch, struggling to filter the sudden spike in ambient temperature. Acheron was a relay meant to listen to the quiet static of deep space, not to shoulder the bandwidth of a burgeoning interstellar empire. The data packets flooding from Earth Command to the Cygnus arm were no longer tactical. The shooting was mostly over. Now came the paperwork. Aelred watched the telemetry scroll across his secondary monitor. It wasn't troop deployments or artillery coordinates anymore. It was tens of thousands of terabytes of colonial administration protocols, martial law guidelines, resource extraction manifests, atmospheric terraforming blueprints designed to scrub the Vrak smog and replace it with a nitrogen-oxygen mix heavily calibrated for human lungs. It was the cold, undeniable architecture of a permanent occupation. Across the room, the plumbing in the small wash basin groaned. Simon was splashing water on his face, his hands shaking so badly water slapped against the cracked mirror. He turned the tap off. The water on Acheron always smelled faintly of iodine and old copper pipes, and Aelred could smell it from his desk, mixing with the sharp tang of Simon's lingering panic. "They brought prefab garrison structures," Simon said. He didn't turn around. He just gripped the edges of the stainless steel sink, his knuckles white. "I was looking at the manifest of the 4th Carrier Group. They didn't just bring Marines. They brought modular concrete foundries, riot suppression gear, agricultural reseeders." Simon finally turned, leaning heavily against the bulkhead. His undershirt was soaked with sweat, his eyes hollowed out and bloodshot. "They knew, Artie, before the sailor even sent that signal. The Directorate has been sitting on this invasion plan for decades. They just needed a reason to open the door." Aelred didn't answer. He couldn't. He just kept his eyes on the live feed still trickling in from Ethelgard. On the screen, a squad of Directorate engineers was busy dismantling a damaged sailor crystalline spire. Sparks rained down from their heavy plasma cutters. Below them, a line of sailor civilians was being herded into a triage center surrounded by razor wire and humming blue energy barricades. Aelred zoomed in on one of the checkpoints. A human marine, helmet removed to reveal a buzz cut and a face smeared with black soot, was handing out Directorate field rations. The sailor civilian, a frail thing with dull, ash-covered feathers, took the grey, foil-wrapped protein block with trembling, three-fingered hands. The alien didn't look grateful. It looked like a beaten dog accepting a scrap from the boot that kicked it. "We saved them," Aelred thought. "The bugs would have eaten them alive. We stopped a genocide." The internal contradiction ground against his ribs like broken glass. He had wanted to do the right thing. He had heard a plea for help and he had answered it. But looking at the brutal grey concrete blocks of the human garrison being violently dropped onto the delicate, sweeping architecture of the sailor city, Aelred realized the horrific truth of their salvation. Humanity hadn't come to rescue the sailor. Humanity had come to claim them. "Stop staring at it." Bee's voice broke the heavy silence. She was sitting on the floor by the primary console array, a heavy steel wrench in her hand. She had taken the casing off the secondary life support manifold and was mindlessly tightening bolts that were already torque-locked. It was her tell. When Bee couldn't fix a situation, she found a piece of machinery to bully. "I can't just turn it off, Bee," Aelred said, his voice raspy. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the thick, greasy layer of sweat and exhaustion on his skin. "I need to log the transition phases for High Command." "You're torturing yourself," she grunted, putting her weight into the wrench. The metal squealed in protest. "You think you pulled the trigger? You didn't. You're just the guy who reported the fire. It's not your fault the fire department showed up with flamethrowers." "I opened the channel," Aelred shot back, a sudden, bitter anger flaring in his chest. "I translated the signal. I hit send. You told me to hit send." Bee stopped tightening the bolt. She let the wrench clatter against the metal deck and slowly stood up, wiping her grease-stained hands on her thighs. She walked over to Aelred's chair, leaning down until she was at eye level. She smelled like engine oil, peppermint, and a deep, exhausting resignation. "Listen to me, Aelred," she said, her voice dropping to a low, hard whisper. "Look out that window. Look at the dark." Aelred turned his head toward the reinforced viewport. The Oort cloud was a vast, empty graveyard of frozen rock and endless black. "For 200 years we sat behind the net," Bee said, her eyes fixed on the void. "We taught our kids that the galaxy hated us. We built guns big enough to crack planets because we were terrified of what was out there. You think a civilization marinates in that much fear, that much isolation, and comes out of it with a balanced perspective?" She pointed a heavy finger at the monitor showing the human occupation forces. "That right there, that is 2 centuries of planetary PTSD. We are a species that was told we were monsters by the civilized universe. So we became the biggest, meanest monsters in the dark, because the alternative was being prey." Bee exhaled a long, ragged sigh. "The sailor were prey, the concordat are prey. We just decided we're not going to let anyone else dictate the food chain anymore." "It doesn't make it right," Simon muttered from the sink, his voice cracking. "Right doesn't exist out here, Simon," Bee snapped, her patience finally fracturing. "Survival exists, and right now, humanity is surviving. The Sealer are surviving. It's ugly, it's brutal, but nobody is being eaten by a wrack hive ship today. If you want a clean conscience, go find a church. We work in a relay station." She turned her back on both of them and walked toward the spiral staircase. "I'm going to the lower decks to reroute the coolant lines. If I don't, the servers are going to melt through the hull. Page me if Earth Command decides to blow up another moon." The heavy bulkhead door slammed shut behind her, the metallic clang echoing painfully in the quiet room. Aelred looked back at the screen. The Marine at the checkpoint was moving down the line, handing out more grey protein blocks. Aelred reached out, his finger hesitating over the physical switch on the console. He pressed it down. The feed cut out, replaced by a black screen and the gentle, bouncing green line of the oscilloscope. He didn't want to watch the Empire being built anymore. The shift clock on the wall clicked over to 0800 hours. The low, rhythmic hum of the scrubbers had finally stabilized, the temperature in the comms bay dropping back down to a chilly, sterile 65 degrees. Aelred sat perfectly still in his leather chair, the leather groaning softly as he took a shallow breath. 72 hours. It had been 72 hours since the alarm first tripped. In 3 days, the entire geopolitical landscape of the galaxy had been violently, irrevocably, violently rewritten. His console chimed. It wasn't the harsh, terrifying blare of an extraterrestrial intercept, nor was it the high-priority, encrypted ping of Fleet Command. It was the standard, mundane chirp of the Directorate's automated shift log system. Aelred opened the message. "Directorate, command to relay Acheron, primary, subspace relay, established via Ethelgard orbital buoys. Acheron, relay redundant, maintain passive scan protocols. Stand down to condition green, good work, station." That was it. Good work. Aelred read the plain white text against the black background. There were no medals. There was no grand acknowledgement of the historical weight of what had occurred in this cramped, foul-smelling room. The Directorate had simply bypassed them. Humanity was out of the cage, and they didn't need the doorman anymore. "Shift's over," Aelred said quietly. Simon, who had finally collapsed into the secondary command chair an hour ago, cracked his eyes open. He looked at the ceiling, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Are we relieved?" "Yeah," Aelred replied, his fingers moving methodically over the keyboard, initiating the automated shutdown sequence for the translation matrix. Command set up their own buoys in the Cygnus arm. "We're back to listening to cosmic background radiation." Simon let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He slowly pushed himself out of the chair, his joints popping. He didn't look at the monitors. He didn't look at Aelred. "I'm going to my bunk. I'm taking a sedative. If the proximity alarms go off again, don't wake me." "Understood," Aelred said softly. Simon shuffled out of the comms bay, his footsteps heavy and dragging on the metal grate. Aelred was alone. He reached over to the edge of his desk. The shattered pieces of his ceramic coffee mug were still scattered on the floor, surrounded by a dried, sticky puddle of brown sludge. He carefully picked up the largest shard, feeling the sharp, jagged edge against his thumb. He thought about the sailor speaker, leaning on his cane, staring into the lens of the camera, as Admiral Miller laid out the brutal new reality of the galaxy. "We are taking over the Night Watch. Humanity had looked out into the vast, dark forest of the universe and decided that hiding in the bushes wasn't an option anymore. They had stepped out onto the path, covered in armor and carrying heavy iron, daring the predators to show themselves. They had saved the helpless, yes, but only to put them on a leash. Aelred stood up. His lower back screamed in protest, a dull, fiery ache shooting up his spine. He walked over to the reinforced viewport and placed his hand against the cold, thick glass. The Oort cloud looked exactly the same as it had 3 days ago. The stars were distant, cold and unblinking, but the void didn't feel empty anymore. It felt heavy. The galaxy had quarantined humanity because they feared we would burn the stars down. They were wrong. Humanity wasn't going to burn the stars down. We were going to build a fortress out of them, and we were going to make everyone else pay the rent. Aelred leaned his forehead against the glass, closing his eyes against the endless dark. He listened to the quiet hum of Acheron, waiting for a sound that he knew would never come again. The sleeping giant was awake, and God help anyone who stood in its way. Thank you for experiencing this deep dive into the darker, grittier side of HFY Sci-Fi. If this grounded look at humanity's brutal awakening and the heavy moral cost of survival resonated with you, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps the channel grow. Share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans who appreciate flawed human characters and morally grey universes. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next transmission from the deep dark. Drop a comment below. Did humanity go too far, or was Admiral Miller right? See you out in the void.